Well, welcome to the Business Spotlight series. My name is Heather Frierson, and I'm your host of the Business Spotlight podcast. And today I have Nguyen, the founder of HomeAds, and she's going to be diving into her business journey, her challenges and best practices, and we're really going to get a sneak peek of what it's like to build and operate a business. So, if this is your first time on the channel today, be sure to like and subscribe to get notifications on the channel so that you don't miss a conversation. Well, V, welcome to the show. I am so glad you're here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I would just love for you to share with our audience a little bit of a background about, who you are and a little bit about your business.
Yeah, for sure. I'll start off with business and then I'll go into where I am.
Perfect. Love
Um,
it.
so HomeAds is a booking site or a listing site for midterm rentals. So essentially for rentals that are 30 days or longer. So if you look at regulations, things like that, most people are familiar with short-term rentals. That's more of the hotel side of things. Is when you get into more of the in-between, the gray
Mhm.
area of, hey, do I want an annual lease or do I want to just go somewhere for the weekend? This is more of a, hey, I have an assignment. I'm here for several months, or I'm relocating. Those kind of use case scenarios. That's what we build home ads for. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself, very briefly too, to kind of back out of that one. Most people kind of ask me how I got into it, and I always joke around saying I had no business doing this at all. And
I
essentially,
think a
it's just
lot of
because
us feel that way.
yeah, it just kind of falls in your lap, and you're like, I'm gonna try doing this, and that was actually me about 8 years ago. I've always been a business person, as in I dabbled in business ever since I was a kid, pretty much. Very entrepreneurial, but I actually went to school for media, so I did like commercials, I did post production, all kinds of. I was very artsy in that aspect. So I double majored in sociology and film. And so I cared about like how things affect society. I care about all those things.
Mm.
Never did I think about coding. Never did I think about technology or anything of that. But oddly enough, there is a little bit overlap of post
Mhm.
production. So if you're editing videos and all the technical sides of it, it overlaps a little bit in the technology side. You just kind of have to say, oh, okay, it's technical in this way. It's kind of similar. Let me try to jump off on that. And so that was
Mhm.
how I got started. Um, I actually had a very different background, but wanted to rent out my own property. Was more of like a entrepreneurial person in the sense of the real estate side initially. And
Mhm.
so I started out more as like a host, or a homeowner initially, and then I thought, well, there's no solutions out there. I'll just build it, which in hindsight, whenever I meet other people, I realize like, oh, how naive was I to think, oh, just build it. I just have a couple of grand, I'll do that. Yeah, very eye-opening experience after that.
Build it and they will come.
Yeah, which is a highly inaccurate.
But it looks like it worked out for you so far. So they are coming.
Yes, that's true. It took some
Yeah.
time. It was definitely some hurdles that we had to get past to get there.
Yeah. Well, especially being in the Austin area, I would think that there's a lot of relocation going on in the past few years. So, can you speak to that a little bit of how you've seen the market change with that?
Yeah, for sure. So we were lucky and unlucky in some senses of starting it in Austin, Texas. Lucky in the sense of it was a kind of considered a second tier growing city, right? If
Hmm.
you look at the apps out there that are more for housing or bookings, they predominantly are in your large metroplexes. So New York City, San
Mm.
Francisco, those are the bulk of it. And we were the random one that was in Austin. And the pros of it was that we started addressing needs from a different niche, right?
Hmm.
We weren't looking at apartment complexes, we were looking at single family homes, right? If you're relocating from DC and you move to Austin, most people can afford to buy a home. And so
Hmm.
they would, but they got into the debacle of, oh, okay, I moved here, I can afford a home, I'll just buy it, I won't have to rent anything in between. And then they
Mm,
realize I am so unhappy in this neighborhood. I did not know that the city was like this. I wish I had moved to this neighborhood. And so
mm,
that was the pain point that we really identified was, hey, for those slightly more affordable cities, which often has changed on the affordability
mhm,
side. But again, it's no New York City, it's no San Francisco, it's
mhm,
there's still larger cities that are not as affordable. And so we kind of honed in on that niche versus a lot of our competitors were people that were looking at apartment complexes,
mm,
which is just extremely different supply, right? Our supply being our housing, our demand being our renters. And so we inadvertently differentiated ourselves that way. The negative part of it is one, if you don't know anything about what you're doing, you normally seek, resources and mentorship, that sort of stuff.
mhm,
Kind of like, if you don't have, maybe you have just certain podcasts and things like that, but you kind of want to know people too, right? You want to know people who
mhm,
have done this. And Austin slash Texas is just really not a consumer state.
mm,
Meaning when you think about technology startups, we like our enterprise. We like B2B deals where it is, hey, I want to go sell to Dell or I'm going to go sell to
mm,
Facebook and I want to make a couple mil here, right? Versus we're working with individual homeowners. And so with consumers,
mm.
that's different metrics that you'd be measuring in comparison to if you were doing more enterprise.
Wow. I really love the model. And I'm sure you get this question often, but just for our listeners to hear, because they might be looking for a place to live, they might be your
Mm-hmm.
customer for sure.
Yep.
What is the difference when you're moving here or looking for something? What's the difference between home ads and
Mm-hmm.
say maybe an Airbnb or something? You mentioned
Yeah.
hotels, but what's the difference there?
Yeah, so there's a lot of nuances, and this is what was very difficult for us early on. So it's the pre-pandemic and then post-pandemic, right? Um, you can't tell investors, hey, you know what, I'm going to pitch you, and a global pandemic's going to happen, and that's what's going to educate the whole world, right? Like no one understands that, but that was what happened.
Mm,
When I originally got into it, I thought more of digital nomads, remote work, and hey, at some point, because I was a video editor, so I traveled the world, and I could be gone for 3 months, and I just needed a hard drive and a laptop, and so it was super easy for me to be a digital nomad or a remote worker. Um,
uh-huh.
and so I thought the whole world is going to change to this at some point, but obviously changing how people live and work is an extremely expensive thing to do, and unpredictable. And so for us, it was very much, difficult in the sense of understanding, hey, this is what's going to happen, in the future, and be able to express that to
Hmm.
investors, consumers, that sort of stuff. Now is a lot easier to say, okay, well, I know the nuances between a short term rental and midterm rental. When we know our user behaviors, if you're renting for a couple of days, do you really care what it's really like?
Hmm.
Is it close to the airport? I don't care if it's close to the airport. I don't
Hmm.
care if it's this. What people don't realize is how much they truly care if they realize, oh, I'm going to be living here for a little while.
Mm,
Then the sales cycle gets longer in the terms of, okay, well, if I'm going to be here for 2 months, I really want to make sure I have a yard because I don't want to, deal with my
yeah.
dog or whatever it is. Or, hey, I am a light sleeper and I don't like airplanes going over all the time. Like that's real important to me. And so everything really shifts, and it's just small
Hmm.
things outside of just regulations. That's a big one. You think about yourself as a homeowner, for instance, a landlord, you have a certain amount of money that you want to purchase a home as an investment property. And then to renovate it and run it, you have a certain
Hmm.
threshold of how much you need to make. Well, if you or your renters, the people that are buying from you, are travelers, they have a certain income and they'll pay a certain amount.
Mm,
And then it's also there's a lot of turnover. You kind of know you have to like reset it, that sort of stuff. When it is a midterm rental, it's a little bit different. Maybe a traveling nurse. They have a decent
mm,
budget, or traveling scholar. It could be, a handful of things. They have a decent budget, but they're also not like partying, So you know that, oh, okay, well, I'll only have to reset, probably have a cleaner come in once a month. So certain threshold of keeping it maintained is lower.
mm,
but then how
Okay.
much you make can also be lower than that of a short-term rental, right? And
Mm,
so the math kind of, it, when I say midterm rentals, it really is mid everything. It's mid in
mm.
pricing, mid in like maintenance, all of those things. And so that's kind of the biggest difference is the use case scenario is you would go to, you know, even for how Airbnb or VRBO or any of those short-term rental sites are, it is an instant book. But that's not how that works with midterm
Mm,
rentals. You want to most want to do screenings. They're going to have like a specific lease. There's just all kinds of things that happen.
mhm,
You need access to your mailbox because you're going to be there for 3 months. But then there's some
mm,
nuances of how homeowners want to deal with that, right? And so it's
mm,
this whole new world, both for the host and the renter to understand. Oh, okay, what are my actual needs if I'm here for a slightly longer term than just a couple
mhm.
of weekends?
I love how I just got the connection when you said digital nomad. That's
Mm-hmm.
homads.
Yep,
I
yep,
love that play on
yep,
words. I
yep,
didn't get
yep,
that at
exactly.
first, but now it all makes sense. I was wondering where the name came from, but now I get it.
Yep.
Um, that's really good information for the customer. How do you become a host?
So to be a host, super easy. You just get a list, right? For us, we have a different model. We have dabbled in, you know, I won't even say dabbled. We have pursued different revenue models, and before we kind of followed the big giants and said, oh, let's do per booking. But per booking, if you're paying for, you know, a weekend, and you're okay with paying $100 maybe in fees, if even, right, from the host side, renter side is higher.
Mhm,
Um, our fee is a little lower than that of the traditional short-term rental sites, but it's for 4 months. That fee looks really big now. Now you're
mm,
paying like $400, right? And so people get, and so even post COVID, the sentiment has been, hey, we don't like the middlemen, right? They don't like the, you know, food apps, all of those things. People are starting to get really frustrated that they're paying fees on top of fees. And
mhm,
so we said, okay, well, if you really want to do this where it is, hey, we're just helping you gain the leads, we're connecting you to the right renter,
mhm.
then we'll do it just as subscriptions. It's just pay a subscription, we give you that lead. If you want to book on our site, then you can book on our site. If you don't want to
Okay.
book on our site and you want to do your own, like, you know, go offline, that's completely fine with us as long as you pay through that, right? Because
Yeah.
there just are things with midterm rentals, as I mentioned, like, you
Mm,
know, screening reports. We allow that, but it makes it so much more intricate versus being able to call up
mhm.
the renter and say, hey, you know what, let me get your information, we're going to run it, and then, you know, move
Yeah.
from there.
Well, it's a great model. I love the idea of home ads, and I'm already thinking of people I can send it to, and I'm sure of a
I
lot of our
appreciate
listeners are
that.
too. So yeah. So you did mention investors, and that kind of brings me
Mm-hmm.
to the question of how did you even start this? And a lot of our entrepreneurs struggle with the same thing. Do you have
Yeah.
founders? Do you have investors? This is a big deal of a company, and what does that look
Yeah.
like?
Yeah, that has been a struggle throughout. And when I say struggle, I don't mean necessarily the raising of money or anything. That is difficult. You know, it's just statistically, you know,
Mm,
us in this room right now, it would be a very difficult conversation occasionally, right? Um, but that's not even what I'm pointing to. It's more of the fact of I don't think most founders and most business owners realize oftentimes it's up to you. I kept
mm,
on thinking, should I go to VCs or should I raise money from angel investors or should I just bootstrap it?
mhm,
And because I lacked that clarity of what I wanted, it was
mhm,
really difficult for me to grow home ads in any specific way. And what I mean by that is, yes, there are some companies that should not do VC money at all because it's just not a company that would scale in a specific way that
mhm.
they want it to be. But there are
Yeah.
occasions, businesses similar to home ads, where you actually have any choice. And
Mm,
my mentors would tell me this, my advisors tell me this, my, you know, even my investors tell me this. And I just didn't know. And
mm,
why I also didn't know is because again we grew it in Austin, Texas, which wasn't
mhm,
your Silicon Valley. I wasn't surrounded by that. Everyone pushed you to bootstrap a lot in Texas. Um,
mm,
and you know, in hindsight, had I started all over again, I probably would go the VC route because I was much younger back then, and
Mm.
like the speed in which you run a company when it's VC backed is extraordinarily fast,
Mm.
exhaustingly fast. My husband actually runs a VC backed company, so we get
Okay.
to juxtapose
You
like,
see it.
hey,
Yes.
what is your life like, and what is my life like, right? Um, I happen to raise from just a handful of angel investors.
Hmm.
And I kind of think that's like the middle ground between VC and
Hmm.
bootstrap, right? A
Sure.
lot of people I know, I'm in a CEO group, and most of them have done, they've been in the business for 20 something years, do several million, and they either started with their own nest of money or they raised from
Hmm.
just a small amount of people and then bootstrap the rest of it. And that's how I eventually fell into it, was because maybe I was in this group more that I started understanding they emphasize things that VCs wouldn't, right? Like
Hmm.
profitability. It sounds crazy, but profitability is something that, if you're VC backed, they don't care about that as much because it's more about like how much is a land grab, how much can you get? And then eventually we'll think of a revenue model, get you profitable, right?
Mm.
Um, Obviously shifted a little bit whenever we went near recession and everyone was pulling back money. But for the most part, they did not care about how much money I was making when I was talking to investors. They cared about vision, right? And these are
Mm.
two completely different things. Now
Right.
we're at a point to where we're profitable, and I'm thinking, well, that's a really nice lifestyle. Like when people say lifestyle business, they really trivialize it. But I know a lot of people who do very, very well with a lifestyle business. And that's kind of where we're at, where it's okay,
Mm.
I'm kind of in middle ground now, where it is, well, I've raised somewhat, and so I need to make sure that my investors get some
Mhm.
kind of liquidity event, or at least that's how I feel responsible for it. Well, at the same time, profitability matters because it's not enough money to get myself to where I don't need to worry about profitability, right? So I'm kind
Mhm.
of in this weird middle ground. If I were to do it again, I would say, look at it and choose what you really want, because you can do
Mhm.
any of them. It's just if you don't choose, you're going to end up like me, stuck in the middle where you're like, oh, I should have
Mm.
done this, and I should, now these are my options, and this is the only way I have. I like where I'm at now, but I would have gotten there so much faster
Mm.
had I actually made up my mind of this is what kind of business I want to run.
How long did you stay in that in between?
I
And what
feel
did you learn?
I feel like I said, I don't even want to admit how long. Pretty much the whole time of home.
Uh,
Like it's only been kind of recently where, because when you think about it, like gaining profitability with a consumer like SaaS product like a booking site, like who does that?
Mhm.
No one does that, right? No one runs Facebook, no one runs Airbnb and said, I'm just gonna raise for my family and friends, and and that's it. No, it doesn't really happen that way, and it's kind of silly to even think that I was very naive to think that I could.
Mm.
I did actually get closer there, but it kind of becomes like, kind of like I said, midterms was right in the middle of everything. My vision
Mhm.
of it was right in the middle of everything. It's the lifestyle business, but nicer because we
Mm.
will likely get acquisition. But then it's also lower than a VC route where it's the large acquisition, right? I'm just gonna probably have like a lifestyle that gets bought up at some point, um, with some effort there. And so that would probably be where I said, I mean, I don't regret it at all,
Yeah.
because I learned so much throughout it. And then it's also, it is helping me now in my career in a lot of ways, and then just income in general, right?
Mhm.
Um, but I think that I was a first time entrepreneur, right? I didn't really have like a technology business until
Yeah.
now. And most people, they talk about startups and they say like, oh, it's like 2 or 3 years and you'll exit or whatever.
Mhm. Mhm.
That's like the serial entrepreneurs. Like most people I know who have sold their company for millions, it took them about 10 years for that first exit.
Okay.
And then their second exit, it took like 2 or 3 because they knew what they're doing, they had credibility, all
Right.
of that.
With the
First time,
first one.
it takes a long time. Yeah.
Yeah. I have so many questions from marketing to all kind of things, but
Hmm.
what I really want to hit on right now is acquisition. That is a
Hmm.
big word and a
Yeah. Yeah.
big goal, I should say.
Yeah.
What 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 are the goals that you're setting right now to even get to that point?
One of the best advice I got from a friend who he ended up selling his company, and he said he regretted one thing he regretted was he should have gotten to know who his acquirers were years ago. It's all relationship, right?
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes people are like, oh, I don't want to talk to them. They're our competitor. Well, your competitor is also likely your acquirer, right? And so, like, understanding what
Mm-hmm.
is the value, like, if you have that conversation and they say, like, I remember actually, I talked to the head of vacation rentals with Airbnb, and he told me, we're not going to work on midterm rentals for the next 5 years, but eventually we'll get into that. And he was highly accurate about it. It took 5 years. It was COVID, but it was true. They don't
Mm-hmm.
have the capacity, right? And if you start working with them, you build trust, because I have gone through a handful of failed acquisition talks
Mm-hmm.
and due diligence. And oftentimes it is okay, well, this is actually the number we're aiming for in terms of
Mm-hmm.
metrics. And you just aren't there yet. And that's the same as, honestly, it's almost the same conversation as with investors, right? Like, what metric do you really care about? And every company will be different, because every company, the
Mm-hmm.
reason you have to understand, why do they want to buy you? Do they want to buy
Yeah.
you because they want to get more users or more customers? They want to buy you because of your team? Like, what is it that
Mm-hmm.
actually matters to them? And if you know the weaknesses of that company and where you may be really good at, you can zone in and say, hey, next 2 years, this is what we're working on. And then we're going to have a relationship with them where we may do a partnership with them. We may do whatever with them, so that
Mm-hmm.
they build the trust of knowing, oh, okay, Homats executes, and they actually are very good in this area that we really like. And that happens pretty often with acquisitions, where I know
Yeah.
some people where they think, oh, we were thinking about closing it down, and then one of our largest partners said, hey, we want to buy you. And so they weren't even thinking that, right? And so there's a lot of
Yeah.
ways in which you're a lot
Yeah.
more valuable to them than you realize.
I think that's so such a good point that you said our competition is likely our acquirer. And I think that's something we know in the back of our mind, but when you're in it, you might try to avoid your competitor. I think of a
Yeah.
lot of cosmetics industry, It Cosmetics is bought by L'Oreal. You can
Mm-hmm.
talk about other digital companies. So that's really smart that you know that ahead of time and you're leaning into what your strength is versus their weakness and how to
Yeah,
bridge that gap. So smart.
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
and one thing I'll point out, sorry
Yeah.
to interrupt there, but it's also really helpful is if you look at your potential competitor, acquirer slash competitor, is to see what their acquisition history is. For instance, there
Mm,
are some companies I won't name that are some of our competitors that they only acqui-hire. They will kill the product and just take the team, right? And if that's not something you want, avoid them.
mm,
There's no reason for you to build a relationship with them, right? So it's not like you have to talk to every one of them, but understand, like,
hmm.
what is their history? Are they someone that likes to buy versus build?
Yeah, I love that. Good. That is really good advice for our listeners. I love that. And for me. Okay, I want to dive in a little bit about even strategy and marketing. When you look at
Mhm.
your role as a founder and you have these big goals, how many hours do you think you spend working, in the business? And how many hours do you
Mhm.
think you spend working, on the business of strategy and planning, et cetera?
One of the things that's somewhat easier is that we aren't a services company, right? I think it's so much easier to get sucked in the business when you run a service company versus
Hmm.
like an actual like fast company. SaaS, you have a little layer in between. Even if, I'm talking to someone on our chatbot, sometimes I'm just in my car and messaging through a chatbot, and I'm the customer service, right? And they have absolutely no idea that is that they
Hmm.
compare us to the large giants and think, hey, you're like Airbnb, like, why aren't you responding in the next like 4 hours, right? But we're not some Aussie team. Is literally just us, right? Um, so essentially, I think it's a little bit easier for us to work on the business, because there is a slight layer where you can say, okay, here are fires that we got to deal with that are our current customers. Um, a little bit easier to handle. I think we actually started doing a lot better as we started focusing more on subscriptions, our revenue model,
Hmm.
metric wise. And what I mean by that is, it was very easy for us to get distracted and say, hey, you know what, we're going to work in development. And then we're gonna do programmatic SEO so that our SEO will be better in the next 6 months. And we'll do, and what we didn't realize is we were spreading ourselves way too thin.
Mm,
I think again, focus. That's probably what I struggle with the most as a founder,
mm,
honestly, is what do I want and how do I focus to get myself there? I'm
mhm.
good at doing everything, and that isn't always good. Um,
Yes.
it wasn't until we said, you know what, I think I had different visions and goals. Once I honed in on just get ourselves profitable. That's a money metric,
Mm,
right? I never had a money metric before, and I realized how interesting my accomplishments also had nothing to do with money metrics. And so, if you're not focused on it, you won't hit it. And so then we said, hey,
mm,
every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, we're looking all our numbers and only metrics that hit these things. If our task that we're working on that week it takes us 1 day and 1 day for it to take impact, that's high priority. If it takes 7 days and it takes 6 months of impact that will have on
mhm,
us, hit us a lower one, right? And so it's like we really have to gauge some of the tasks of really what does that have that impact on that specific metric versus, oh, it'd
mm.
be really nice if we can just redo our search page, right? Like, but what does that have to do with our metric, right? And so that was what we had to hone in on is, don't just build because you love building products or you want, one user
Mm.
complained about it. It doesn't matter if, it doesn't affect a specific metric, at least not at this point.
I think that's so good to say. We don't need to rebuild the web page if it's not producing really focus over here. It's so good. And it sounds like to me, that as a business owner from beginning to where you are now, you've really grown
Yeah.
into, like you said, focusing on different areas and what's important. So I wonder, as you look back on your journey, what has been the biggest challenge? Maybe it was this that you just talked about, but what's been the biggest challenge and how did it enable you to grow?
I think the biggest challenge really has been, I mean, I pointed out, I think two of it, right? Is like, what do you really want and what are you
Mm,
focused on? Um, I didn't know what I wanted. I just loved a challenge. And so I took
mm,
every challenge possible. I took that challenge, accomplished it, but it's like, is public speaking a challenge I need to like conquer right now? What does that do for my bottom line, right? And I was young and I was thinking, oh, I've never done this before. I'd love it. I'd spend the time and all these things. But then it falls into the second hurdle of focus. Right? It's
mm,
like, okay, well, I've been doing this for a while and I'm not accomplishing the things that I now am
mm,
seeing as important. And focus, what's hard is when I almost think in larger companies you can focus more because everyone's siloed into
mhm,
their little tasks, right? Or their like specialty.
mhm,
When you're smaller and you're capable of doing everything, it's
mm,
harder to say, no, I'm not doing that. That doesn't impact what I really want to accomplish right now. It's harder to say no and then just focus on those things. And so I think I struggled the most there. It wasn't until, and maybe this is also very interesting, is my CEO group, everyone always says, what's your runway? Right? Like when we weren't
mm, mhm,
profitable, when is it that you gotta shut down the company? And I just did not really understand that, which is probably why I foolishly ran it for some years where I shouldn't have, and maybe I should have shut it down, right? Um, but I realized I always said I don't have a runway because I always knew I
mhm,
could hustle in some way and like make money,
mhm,
contract, do whatever. I could always run it. In a way, I was almost too comfortable. There are people
mm,
who either one, they have a lot of money to where they can just say, hey, it's not sunk cost fallacy. It's just whatever. I put money in and I can close it down. So there's one spectrum where you have a ton of resources and you say, I'm just losing opportunity costs. And then there's the other side where it's hey, I don't have enough money. If it doesn't hit these goals, I have to shut it down. I
mm,
was at a place where I said, you know what, I can house hack, I can home ads out my place and like which I did. And I can always make money, right? That actually was really what made it harder for me is because I
mm,
didn't give myself an actual legitimate runway of, hey, if I don't hit these metrics, like don't keep going. There's those metrics
mm,
are speaking to you for a reason. Timing was really important. I was 8 years too early. Had I started home as a year ago, I probably would have done better than had I started 8 years ago.
I love that metrics are speaking to you. I wrote that down. I think that's really smart to know when to
Yeah.
exit and maybe when even to push through, that you're
Yeah,
almost there. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I'd like to dive in a little bit into your team. You say we a lot.
Mhm.
Um, what does that look like?
So we have expanded and then, contracted quite a bit. Before COVID, we were around 15, and it was a lot of developers. Back
Hmm.
then, we were working on traditional development. Um, so just your typical code, Rails, um, and React, I believe, was on our front end. And I had, my CTO, we had about 5 or 7 developers. They're all contractors working part-time.
Hmm.
And that's also what's difficult is everyone was a contractor, including
Hmm.
myself. And you just can't really get a lot of work done. One, on traditional development, that's my personal
Hmm.
experience, personal belief. And then two, with a low budget and also with contractors. And then we had our marketing people. We had tons. I always joke around saying Home Ads was built off of like sweat equity and a ton of students. Like students love us because we're interesting, we're fun. They learn so much on the startup side, but we also are able to build
Hmm.
something with lower resources.
You had some digital
After
nomads working for you.
exactly, yeah, we did. We actually everyone was everywhere over the world for a bit. And then now the main one is me and Sandy. So she is probably like, you wouldn't call her a co-founder because she wasn't there at the beginning, but she's pretty much there as like,
Hmm.
a legitimate business partner in all decisions, everything we do. We had 3 interns previously before, but has actually been a lot easier. I was solo for a while during COVID, and I was refusing to bring anyone on because
Hmm.
it was so stressful. I remember thinking,
Sure.
oh, one of my developers, he's about to have a baby, he's got to pay his mortgage. I
Mm.
got to make sure that, like, you worry about everyone's families and their goals and everything. And so you think, okay, I got to keep this going. I can't quit it. And I think that was what was hard for me.
Mm.
But I would have sleepless nights where I would have insomnia for God knows how
Mm.
long. And I was just thinking, we aren't, I got to go raise more money. I got to do this. Like, this is going to get us further in
Mm.
debt. Like, it was just bad. And I said, I never want to get into that space again. And so when Sandy came on, and she was wanting the experience, she was like, you don't have to pay me a lot to do this. I really like working with you. Even then, I was so hesitant because I was like, no, I don't want to take on anyone. I was so hesitant, but now she and I
Yeah.
are pretty much like partners and everything.
Yeah. That's awesome. Everybody needs a Sandy, it sounds like.
Yeah.
There. Yeah. Yeah. So just to dive a little bit into marketing, because a lot of our listeners are entrepreneurs, and that's one of the toughest areas that I
Mhm.
think a lot of us struggle with. So when you look at how you're marketing, how do you market? No, I almost said
Yep.
nomads. How do you market to nomads
Yep.
so that
Yep.
people know about you?
I think that is some part is where you won't ever win with the VC backed companies because it's just money,
Mm.
right? Is always just how much can you buy in ads? Like even some of our competitors slash acquirers, they talk about, we can work with you as a vendor, or we can just put it to Google Ads and do, this way
Hmm.
or that, right? It's like biz dev or whichever way. Um, this is almost like the story of like startups versus like big corporates. Even is
Hmm.
there are pros and cons. Big corporates, everyone knows your Dell, but then the smaller competitors, I say Dell because they're up in Austin or like Round Rock area, so I always think of them as corporate.
Hmm.
um but then you have startups that move faster, you're more agile on certain things, and that's kind of where you have to really hone in on. Um, I was actually taught, I mentioned this earlier about programmatic SEO, and I love this, but it also comes from, I had mentioned that we were doing traditional development. I then rebuilt our site using low code. So it is visual development, if you're familiar with
Mm.
it, and just taught myself. And, pretty much that
Nice.
is what changed everything for us. We went faster, and that was when we could hone in on the speed part, where most startups are really good because they're faster. And so we got to
Mm.
do that. In terms of marketing, the same can be said here is, have you heard of the company Zapier?
Yes, of
It's
course.
like, yeah.
The
So
connection
Zapier,
between two.
mhm,
Yes.
exactly. So this is a good example of doing programmatic SEO. Is they were able to create a template of, hey, this is the typical information that goes into this article, and then change out certain components of that template with Google Calendar and Google Meet, right? Two apps that you would normally connect. And
Hmm.
if you can think of something where you have multiple components, where it can be thousands, and they have thousands of it, they could then create articles that were almost the exact same, but different content. And when you can
Oh,
do
based
that,
on
and
SEO.
yep, based on SEO, and then you can use ChatGPT, for instance, to write
Hmm.
small components of those things. Start filling it out, building out those sites. They did thousands, hundreds of thousands of articles, and they were getting, I think, like 1 million site visits a month. And they didn't have a ton of money to do it. It was just a little bit of
Mm,
development and trying to architect out how will these pages work. For us, it was, hey, we created a lot that were neighborhood guides. How many neighborhoods are there in the US? We chose specific cities and we built out things, and we also said, how does midterm rentals relate to these neighborhoods if you're moving, that sort of stuff. And that's how you get the impressions, right? So, and long story short, when
hmm.
the question you're asking is, how do you get known? You have to hack it in a way that corporates don't have to. They have money. You got to hack
Mm.
it in a way where it's like, hey, we're pretending we have money. And so we can
Yes.
create content at a much faster and, better quality speed.
With the use of AI, like you said, Chat GPT
Exactly.
and other. So that's really interesting. And I'm sure
Yep.
you've seen a lot of, because you're using it, it's worked well, especially when you're
Yep.
targeting neighborhoods. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. So you just have to think of what applies to your business, right? It's like what
Hmm.
components. Like for us, we know leases change state by state. So writing an article based off of every state and then
Hmm.
having it connected in a master, like you just have to think of, those components, that how you can
Yeah.
interchange it.
Do you have like a CRM that you use that when people do come in the site that you're marketing to that way as well?
We
Like
don't do
newsletters
as
or
much on the, yeah, we do
yeah.
have the newsletters. So you can come in, you can do your newsletters. And then obviously when they become a user, we kind of know if you're a
Right.
host or not. So we have a handful of those things. There's a lot of ways in which
Yeah.
we try to do our best in providing the most valuable
Hmm.
content. And that's also where we can differentiate from competitors. Is we know we're one of the best when it comes to midterm
Yeah.
rentals. We actually were one of the first ones calling it midterm rentals or MTRs because it just didn't exist.
Yeah.
So why not, if we've been in the game for this long, at least hone in on the skills of,
Right.
we understand this industry very
Yeah.
well.
Because I'm sure you have a lot of repeat customers that, especially
Yeah.
if they do work different places. Yeah. I want to think about the future. We talked a little bit about it, how you have some big plans with acquisition, but let's keep it to maybe 3 to 5 years. Where do you see
Mm-hmm.
yourself maybe in 3 years?
In 3 years, I mean, my hope is honestly, it's funny because that was a different, had you asked me this like years before, I probably would say differently. There are two routes though. And this is interesting, is because as I say, hey, you got to know what you want, and the focus is
Hmm.
also, there's a caveat to that too. Is like, you can go down that route, but you may not ever get it. And so there
Mm,
are always the plan A and plan B, right? And
yeah.
that's probably where I suffer the most, is where it's well, there is the plan B. And so then I always think, well, we don't have to get plan A if plan B works out in this
Hmm.
way, right? So there are two routes to go where we're at least, is, hey, if it makes sense, then you raise just enough to where you are valuable enough to get acquired, but you
Hmm.
have to know what the problem with that is. If you don't know what your acquirer wants, you build towards something and it may not be what they care for, right? And then
Hmm.
you took on a whole bunch of money, and
Yeah.
now how do you get that exit? Um, the other route is, hey, you're profitable, slowly grow it to where you don't have to get acquired, but if you're doing well and you don't have to do a lot to maintain it, and you just have a handful of people, then
Yeah.
that's okay too. And that's how a lot of them have grown. And then once they got so big, that's when they got acquired anyway. So
Yeah.
plan B can become plan A in this case too. It's just
Right.
not as focused, right? So ideally for us is to be able to get acquired, just because
Yeah. You have a vision.
in my space. Yeah, I have a vision,
Yeah.
and also in my space, I know that that's kind of how it will consolidate
Yeah.
within the midterm
Yeah.
rental side.
I love that. Well, I want to have a little fun and go into some rapid fire questions
All right.
if you're ready. Okay. What do you think is the key to success for you?
Well, I think I've answered this one, right? Is focus.
Yeah.
Key to success is focus for me.
Yeah. I like that. You've had to have a little bit just so you know to get to where you are. So, but I
Yeah,
get it. And
yeah.
maybe this is the same advice, but what is your one piece of advice you would have for other business owners?
Actually, I had a friend that was telling me that her sister's brother was going to quit his job and start a business. And it's funny is because as much of an entrepreneur I am, and especially like I'm a very like, like women go do your thing, all of that. And, don't get bogged down by what people say, because it is very
Hmm.
easy to
Yeah.
be told like, oh, this isn't going to work or stuff. But when I actually give advice, I actually want people to know the hard truth of entrepreneurship
Mm.
too. I had another girlfriend who has done really well, and she said, and it resonated with me. She said, entrepreneurship, the dream of entrepreneurship is sold irresponsibly. And I think that's actually very true. Is when I got into startups, I thought, oh, it's like 3 or 4 years, you exit, and all that stuff. And then I got into my CEO group where everyone bootstrapped. Most of them said it was between 8 to 10 years. They said, I didn't pay myself until then. And I was
Mm.
horrified, but then I also was like, oh, that sounds actually very accurate. Had someone told me this, it
Yes.
probably would have. So, if you don't have the runway or grit to even get through that,
Hmm.
maybe consider something else. But I wish
Yeah.
someone had told me that before. So I think that would
So
be my
everybody
advice is,
listen right now. 8 to 10 years
yeah,
could be.
it could be.
It
But
could
then
be.
after that, they are able to raise their kids, get them through college. It's a much, I would say, easier life, but kind of not too. You're your own boss and
Hmm.
you're doing really well. But every time we have our group, it's oh, I'm really tired. You don't have stability. You don't have stability like you
Hmm.
do at a 9 to 5
Yeah.
typically. And so there's pros and
Good
cons.
advice. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, what is a book or podcast that you are reading or listening to reading or listening
Hmm.
to right now that you would recommend?
I just finished Contagious, and that was mostly because we were looking at more of like marketing, what makes people share things.
Hmm.
I love, I did sociology, so psychology kind of falls slightly into that, and so I really like understanding, why people buy, the psychology of buying and things like that. So Contagious is
Hmm.
a really good one. The second one I'm just starting, but is pretty good, is Unreasonable Hospitality. And that one's
Yeah.
actually about restaurants, but it's
Hmm.
really good because it helped me shift my mindset. I think I was starting to
Hmm.
get jaded with our users, and I had to
Sure.
re-engage with them and
Yeah.
realize, okay, it's just me. I need to like,
Yeah.
you know, give them the right type of customer service, the right kind of experience.
Hmm.
And they
That's
don't
good.
just, get through the system randomly, without that.
Yeah. I've heard of that book a few times, so I'm going to have to
Mm,
pick that one up. Okay,
it's
this is
pretty
a
good.
really, yeah, that's what I hear. So I'm going to have to get that one for sure. Okay, this is a really fun question. If you had a little bit of magic dust, I could choose one spot in your business, where would you sprinkle it?
Hmm. I feel like sales, even though it's sales, it's BD/sales, I
Hmm.
am the best person for it. But when I say best person, it's two of us, so is that really like best, right? Is most people always say they hate sales, and I have grown to love it more than I usually would. But I know that there are so many unknowns, like
Mm.
so there are so many spectrums of sales. Doing corporate sales is very different, and I'm learning that. Doing all I am jokingly, one of my developers, he always said, "You're the most logical woman I know." And what he meant that is I'm just really like black and white. It is, and when it comes to sales and getting people to buy, and it's a lot of emotion, it's a lot of psychology. And a part of me is just thinking, I can just give you the details
Yeah.
of the deal and you would interested or not interested. But that's not how that actually works. Good salespeople know how to work that.
Mm.
And I wish I had that in me. I'm just such a straightforward person. I'm probably more of an
Yeah.
engineer mind than I am of a salesperson. So that's probably where I would love to have help there.
Yeah, yeah, I feel you. Okay, before we get to the before we get to the last question, tell our audience how they can find you, follow you, and all the good things.
For sure. So Homads is spelled HOMADS. You can find us. You will probably do best by just going straight to our site. So it's homads.com. And then we have a spot for newsletter. You can sign up, whether you're a host or looking for a rental. We'll keep you
Hmm.
updated within the newsletter within that. Or if you don't want to sign up, you can just get the newsletter. We're also on most socials. We're most prominent on Facebook. We have a couple of Facebook groups as well. We have the
Oh,
MTR midterm rental host community. If you happen to be a host, it's one of the largest ones. I think it is the largest directly just midterm rental site. We have about 18,000, about 19,000 hosts on there.
wow.
So it's a good resource for you if you're just starting to get into it and you're thinking,
Yeah.
okay, I don't know how to deal with utilities. I don't know just basic things. It's made
Hmm.
for a resource for a host there.
That's
So
great.
we're obviously very active there as well.
That's cool. Awesome. Okay, so we've come to the last question of the day, and that is what's most inspiring you today?
Hmm. So I have very self-deprecating humor. So most people, if you don't know me, will be like, "Oh, it's okay." Like they try to comfort me. But probably my age. I think my age. So I turned 38 next month.
Mm,
Um, and when I started it, I think I was 29, right? 29
wow.
when the idea first started, right?
Sure.
We probably didn't get movement in until a couple of years in, but I would say back then I could do whatever I wanted and it didn't
Mm.
matter. I could focus on whatever, it didn't matter. Now it matters. Now it is like, you have family, you have other people
Hmm.
involved. And you're just getting old. So I think age is something that motivates you to say, you know what, V,
Yes.
does this matter? Do you actually have to say yes to this? Do you actually
Mm,
need to focus your time on this? Because, by this time, also in age, your friends, well, I always say to friends, and not in like a hoity toity way, but it's like, we all have only a certain amount of time. So when you spend
right.
time with someone, it's because you deliberately want to spend time with
Mm,
them. Back then,
so
maybe you're
true.
making tons of new friends and things like that, but like I am very deliberate with my time.
Hmm.
And so I think what motivates me is the lack of time in everything from the day to what I have remaining
Yeah.
before I may die.
Yeah. I
Hopefully that's
love
not
that
too
answer.
grim.
No, it's not. I actually love that answer to think,
Okay.
one, you've accomplished a lot to even think of it that way, but also it encourages you to make it matter and your time
Yeah.
to make it matter. So I think that's great. I really enjoyed this conversation. I know two people that I'm going to send home ads to. I hope all of our listeners are doing the same. Your story is just really encouraging. So thank you for sharing.
Thank you
It's
so much
great.
for having me.
Yeah, I just want to also encourage everyone to like and subscribe to the show so that you don't miss any conversation or show just like this one. You get a notification. We just really appreciate it. Thanks to everyone for joining us today, and a special thanks to you, V, for being with us. It was amazing.
It is my pleasure.